The water wheel had not turned in 3 days, and Henrietta Conley had run out of patience with waiting for someone else to fix it. She stood at the edge of the creek bank in the gray light of an early October morning in 1882, her boots already sinking into the soft mud, her dark hair pinned back under a wide-brimmed hat that was doing absolutely nothing to keep the drizzle off her face. The rain had started the night before, that slow, relentless kind that soaked through wool and leather, and settled into a person's bones like a debt that couldn't be paid. It wasn't the dramatic thunderstorm kind of rain that came sweeping across the Kansas prairie with lightning and fury. It was the patient kind, the grinding kind, the kind that seemed to have no opinion about whether you were standing in it or not. The wheel itself was a sturdy old thing, or it had been once. Her husband Thomas had built it 6 years ago with timber hauled from the mill in Hargrove, and for most of those 6 years it had turned faithfully, drawing water up to the trough that fed the barn and the kitchen garden and the small stone tank that sat beside the house. Thomas had been proud of it in that quiet way he had been proud of most things he built, not boastful, just satisfied. He would stand on the porch sometimes in the evenings and watch it turn in the current, and Henrietta had always thought that the sound of it, that steady low creak and splash, was one of the sounds she most associated with him being alive. Thomas had been dead for 11 months now. A fever had taken him in the November of 1881, fast and merciless the way fevers could be out here on the frontier, where the nearest proper doctor was 2 hours by horse in dry weather, and considerably longer when the creeks were swollen. She had done everything she knew how to do. She had packed him in cold cloths and made him drink broth and sat beside him through 4 nights without sleeping more than a few minutes at a stretch, and on the 5th morning he had simply been gone. He was 34 years old. She was 31. They had no children, which was a grief of its own kind, though in the months since his death she had sometimes thought that the absence of children was the only thing that had allowed her to keep the farm running at all, because there was no one depending on her to slow down or stop or weep at appropriate intervals. She wept when she could afford to. The rest of the time she worked. The wheel had stopped turning because one of the main paddle boards had cracked down its center, and the crack had widened over the past 2 weeks until the board finally broke entirely, catching in the wooden frame and jamming the whole mechanism. Without the wheel, she had been hauling water by bucket from the creek 3 times a day, which added nearly 2 hours to her daily labor and left her hands raw and her shoulders aching from the weight of the yoke she used to carry the buckets. She had sent word to Abe Tilden, who ran the general store in the town of Callow Creek 4 miles to the north, and who also served as a sort of informal message board for the community. She had asked him to pass along that she needed a hand with the wheel, that she could pay in kind with preserved goods or a portion of the fall harvest. 3 days had passed and no one had come. She understood why. October was a brutal month for work on the prairie. Everyone was harvesting. Everyone was preparing for winter. Everyone had their own list of repairs that needed doing before the cold settled in. She was not angry at her neighbors. She was simply done waiting. The problem with the water wheel was not complicated, not in theory. She needed to remove the broken paddle board, which was jammed in the lower section of the wheel where it met the wooden housing frame, and replace it with new timber. She had timber. Thomas had kept a supply of planking in the barn for exactly these kinds of repairs, and she had found 3 boards the right length stacked against the back wall, seasoned and solid. The challenge was that the wheel weighed several hundred pounds, and the broken board was wedged in such a way that she needed to work against the current to free it, and the rain had raised the creek about 4 inches above its normal level. She had spent the previous evening sketching out the approach in her mind the way Thomas had taught her to think through problems, draw the whole picture first, then work backwards to the individual steps. She knew which bolts to loosen. She knew where the load points were. She had the tools laid out on an oilcloth in the barn, a heavy wrench, a mallet, a wood chisel, a length of rope, and a pry bar that Thomas had always called the most useful object ever forged. Henrietta tied the rope around the base of the nearest cottonwood tree, threaded it through the iron ring at the top of the wheel housing frame, and tested the tension. The rope was good. She had checked it twice. She pulled on her work gloves, took a breath of the cool, wet air, and waded into the creek. The cold hit her immediately, pressing through her skirt and petticoat and stockings and settling around her calves with a kind of deliberate thoroughness. She had rolled her skirts up and tucked them as best she could, but within 30 seconds of entering the water she was soaked to the knee. The creek bottom was slick with algae-covered stones, and she moved carefully, keeping her weight low and her eyes on the wheel. The broken board was worse than she had thought from the bank. The crack had not just widened. The board had twisted as it broke, driving one end down into the wooden housing track and wedging itself there with a pressure that the current kept renewing every second. She could see immediately that she would need to work from above and below simultaneously, which meant she would need to fix the rope higher on the frame to hold the wheel from turning while she worked. She backed out of the creek, adjusted the rope, and went back in. For the next hour and a half, Henrietta Conley worked in the rain and the rising cold with a focused, unhurried intensity that she recognized in herself as the same quality that had kept her farm alive through the 11 months since Thomas died. She was not fast, but she was methodical. She freed the top of the broken board with the chisel and mallet, working against the grain of the wood where the split had gone jagged. She used the pry bar to open the gap in the housing track enough to angle the broken piece upward, and she discovered partway through this process that the track itself had a small crack in it that she hadn't seen from the bank, which meant she needed to address that as well before she set the new board. She was not angry about this discovery. She noted it, revised her mental picture, and continued. The rain intensified around mid-morning, going from the patient drizzle to something more serious, the kind of rain that came in sheets and turned the surface of the creek into a churning, pocked sheet of silver. She was soaked through entirely now, her hat heavy with water, her gloves dark and cold. Her fingers had gone from cold to numb to a kind of absent pain that she knew would return with some viciousness once she warmed up again. She kept working. She extracted the broken board in 2 pieces, wading back to the bank twice to deposit the pieces above the waterline. She used the chisel and a small hand plane she had thought to bring out from the barn to smooth the split edge of the housing track, then wrapped it with a strip of canvas soaked in pine tar that she carried in her coat pocket, because Thomas had always said pine tar was the single best thing for keeping wood tight against water. Then she went back to the barn for the new board. It was heavier than she had anticipated in the abstract, though she had known in the practical sense that it would be heavy because she had lifted planks like it before. The difference now was that her arms were tired and her hands were cold, and the walk from the barn to the creek was 40 yards of muddy ground that wanted to pull her boots off at every step. She got the board to the bank in 2 trips, resting it halfway on a fence post to shift her grip. Setting it into the wheel housing was the hardest part. The board had to go in at an angle, seated into the upper slot first and then pivoted down and locked into the lower mounting pin, and the whole operation required her to be in the water with both arms raised above her head, while the current pushed against her legs and the rain beat down on her back, and the wheel itself, held only by the rope, shifted and groaned with every gust of wind. She dropped the board once. It hit the water and the current caught it, and she grabbed it with one hand while her other hand gripped the iron ring on the frame, and for a moment she was pulled sideways in the water and her boots slipped on the algae-covered stone beneath her, and she went down to one knee in the creek with the water surging up around her thigh and the board trying to escape downstream. She held it. She got her feet under her. She stood back up. She repositioned the board against the housing slot with her eyes half closed against the rain, feeling by touch where the grain of the wood met the groove in the frame, and she seated it home with 3 blows of the flat of her palm against the top edge, and she heard the satisfying, unmistakable thunk of timber finding its place. She reached down through the water, felt the lower mounting pin, guided the board's bottom edge to it, and pressed it home. She released the rope from the iron ring slowly, feeding it out hand over hand, and the wheel shifted, groaned, shuddered once as the current began to work against the new board, and then turned. One full, slow, deliberate revolution, and then another, and then the familiar creak-hand splash rhythm that Henrietta had associated with Thomas being alive rose up from the water and the machinery, and filled the rainy air of the creek bank. She stood in the water for a moment with her arms hanging at her sides, watching the wheel turn, and she was too exhausted and too cold to cry, but something moved through her chest that was made of grief and pride in equal measure, and she let herself feel it for exactly as long as she could afford to, which was about 30 seconds. Then she began wading back to the bank. She did not see the horse until she was nearly at the edge of the water. It was a large bay, standing at the fence line near the barn, and astride it was a man who was looking at her with an expression she would later describe to herself as completely struck dumb. He was sitting very still in the saddle, his hat pulled low against the rein, and he was staring at her with the particular quality of attention that a person gives to something they have not fully processed yet. Henrietta looked at him. He looked at her. She stepped up onto the bank and water ran off her skirts in sheets, and her boots made a sound like two wet fish being dropped onto a dock with every step she took, and she pushed her hat back on her head and looked at the man on the horse and said, "Can I help you?" He opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. He started, then stopped. "If you're looking for the Whitmore place, it's 3 miles north and east," Henrietta said, wringing out the hem of her skirt with both hands. "Follow the creek road past the cottonwood break and you'll see the silo." "I'm not looking for the Whitmore place," the man said. His voice, once he found it, was a low baritone with something rough at the edges, like a stone that had been worn mostly smooth by a river but still had angles if you pressed. "My name is Harlan Watkins. Abe Tilden sent me. I came to help with the water wheel." Henrietta looked at him. She looked at the water wheel, which was turning steadily behind her in the rain, the new board catching the current with a clean, solid sound. She looked back at Harlan Watkins. "You're a little late," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not embarrassment exactly, but something close to it, overlaid with what she thought might be a kind of helpless admiration. He dismounted slowly from the bay horse, and she could see him more clearly now. A tall man, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark canvas duster over a wool shirt, with hands that looked like they had done considerable work in their time, and a face that was weathered and lean and somewhere in the vicinity of 35 years old. She guessed, with dark eyes that were currently taking in the full picture of her soaked to the skin, covered in mud from the knee down, smelling of creek water and pine tar, with an expression that she could only read as complete and utter astonishment. "You fixed it yourself," he said. "It was not quite a question." "I did," she said, "in this rain." The rain did not help, no. He stood beside his horse and looked at the wheel and then at her again, and she could see him working through something internally, some recalibration of what he had expected to find when he rode up to the Conley farm on behalf of Abe Tilden's message network. She supposed he had expected to find a widow in distress, waiting helplessly for someone capable to arrive and take the problem off her hands. She was familiar with that expectation. She had spent 11 months correcting it in various people. "Can I at least water my horse?" he asked. She almost smiled. "Almost. Troughs around the side of the barn," she said. "And if you're willing to earn your ride back to town, you can start by carrying that oilcloth and those tools up from the bank. I'm going inside to change before I catch my death." She walked past him toward the house, and she heard him say, quietly, not quite to himself but not quite to her either, "Lord Almighty." She did not turn around. Inside the house, Henrietta stripped out of her wet clothes and hung them over the drying rack near the small iron stove that was the heart of the farmhouse. The house was not grand, 2 rooms on the ground floor, a sleeping loft above, plank floors that she had scrubbed until they were smooth, a stone fireplace at one end and the iron stove at the other, Walls hung with the practical accumulation of 8 years of homesteading. Tools, dried herbs, a calendar from the hardware store in Hargrove, a watercolor that Thomas's sister in Ohio had sent as a wedding gift. It was spare and ordered, and it smelled of wood smoke and dried lavender, and the faintly sweet, grassy smell of the prairie that seeped in through the chinking between the logs no matter how carefully she rechinked it every spring. She dressed in dry clothes, a wool skirt, a heavy flannel shirt, thick stockings, and put the kettle on the stove. Then she stood at the window and looked out at the rain and the creek and the turning wheel, and she let herself feel, very briefly, the full weight of how tired she was. It was not just the morning's work. It was 11 months of work, 11 months of being the only person who could do any of it, 11 months of learning things she had never been taught because there was no one to teach her, and the farm needed them done. She had learned to butcher hogs. She had learned to reshoe a horse in a passable fashion that the horse at least tolerated. She had learned the price of winter wheat at 4 different buyers in 2 counties, and she had learned which of those buyers would try to cheat a woman doing business without a husband beside her, and she had learned the particular cold, polite tone of voice that she used with those buyers that made clear she was aware of what they were doing and was not going to let them do it. She had not learned, yet, how not to be lonely. That one was harder. There was a knock at the door, 3 solid knocks, nothing tentative about it. She opened it. Harlan Watkins was standing on her porch with the oilcloth folded under one arm and the tools collected in a neat bundle in the other, the rain still coming down around him, and he was looking at her with an expression that had settled from astonishment into something more measured and careful, the way a person looks when they're trying to figure out how to say something without putting a foot wrong. "Tools are here," he said. "The oilcloth I folded as best I could. I noticed your axe in the tool pile, the handle's cracked. I can fix it for you if you have a spare handle." Henrietta blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that was not among them. "There's a spare handle in the barn," she said, "on the shelf above the seed bin, but you don't need to do that." "I know I don't need to," he said simply. "I came to help and arrived too late to help with the wheel, so it seems like I should find something useful to do while I'm here." She looked at him for a moment. The rain dripped off the brim of his hat in a thin, steady stream. He looked back at her without any particular anxiety about whether she was going to accept the offer, as though he had made it and was simply waiting to see what happened next. "There's coffee inside," she said. "Come in out of the rain and we'll discuss what needs doing." He came inside, removing his hat at the door and hanging it on the hook she indicated, and looked around the room with the quiet, assessing look of a person who is genuinely interested in what a place tells them about the person who lives in it. He did not say anything for a moment, just took it in, and Henrietta found herself oddly aware of what he was seeing, the tidiness of it, the functional order, the small but definite signs of a woman who had made a home alone and kept it. "Sit down," she said, indicating the table. "The coffee will be a few minutes." He sat. She noticed that he sat with a certain carefulness at her table, like a man who was aware that he was a large person in a woman's space and was trying to take up the appropriate amount of room and not more. She noticed this and she noted it, and it moved up slightly in her assessment of him. "How do you know Abe Tilden?" she asked, setting 2 cups on the table. "He sold me a horse last spring," Harlan said. "I've been working the circuit since then, doing repair work, carpentry, that kind of thing. Barns, fences, mills. I came through Callow Creek 2 days ago and Abe mentioned your situation. You're a traveling carpenter, among other things. Before that I was a ranch hand over in the territory near Dodge City." He paused. "Before that I was a lot of other things." "Where are you from originally?" "Tennessee," he said. "A long time ago." The coffee was ready and she poured it and sat across from him at the table. The rain pounded on the roof above them. The stove ticked and popped with heat. Outside, through the window, the water wheel turned in its steady, patient rhythm. "I'm Henrietta Conley," she said, "though I expect Abe told you that." "He did," Harlan said. "He also told me your husband passed last year. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she said. She said it the way she always said it now, with a directness that acknowledged the condolence without pulling it apart into pieces. She had learned that if she let people linger too long on their sympathy, it tended to dissolve into a kind of useless pity that was harder to deal with than simple grief. Thomas was a good man. "The wheel he built has good bones," Harlan said. "I could see that when I looked at it. The main housing is solid. He knew what he was doing." Something warm moved through her chest at that, something she hadn't expected. The pleasure of hearing Thomas's work spoken of with respect by someone who understood what good work looked like. She felt her posture ease slightly. He was self-taught, she said. He read everything he could find on mechanics and millwork. He had 3 books he'd ordered from a catalog in St. Louis, and he read them until the covers came off. Harlan nodded, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "That's how most things get built out here," he said. "Nobody teaches you. You just figure it out or it doesn't get done." "Yes," she said. "Exactly." They sat for a moment in the comfortable way of two people who have unexpectedly found a point of agreement on something that matters to them. The rain continued. The wheel continued. Henrietta looked at the man across her table and thought about how strange it was that she had not had a conversation of this kind. Not just polite exchanges about weather and prices, but an actual back and forth about things in quite a long time. She did not dwell on the thought. She filed it away. "Tell me about the axe handle," she said, "and anything else you notice that needs attention." For the next half hour, Harlan told her what he had observed in his 10 minutes at her property. And it was an unexpectedly thorough list delivered without any of the condescension she sometimes encountered from men who seemed to believe that a woman living alone must be helpless and overwhelmed. He reported what he saw the way one professional might report to another. The axe handle, cracked along the grain. A section of fence near the western pasture where 2 rails had come loose and were being held in place more by habit than by the remaining nails. The barn door that hung slightly off plumb and was catching on the ground when it swung wide. And the base of the chimney, which had a gap in the mortar on the north-facing side that would let in water and potentially ice once the hard cold came. She knew about 3 of these 4 things. The chimney gap was new information. "I missed that," she said. "It's on the back side," he said, without any edge to it. "You'd have to look for it from the north. How long would it take to repoint the mortar? 2 hours if the rain stops. I'd need to wait for the stone to dry out a bit, but that wouldn't be today's work regardless." She looked at him across the table. He looked back at her with those dark, steady eyes that had recovered completely from their initial stunned blankness and were now simply watchful and calm. "You're offering to come back," she said. "I'm offering to finish the job," he said. "The chimney mortar and the fence rails and the barn door are a day's work. If you can use me, I'll come back tomorrow and get it done. Same terms as you offered Abe, pay in kind." Henrietta considered. She was not in the habit of accepting help easily, and she was particularly careful about men she didn't know, partly from the general caution that a woman living alone on the frontier needed to exercise, and partly from a specific instinct she had developed over the years for reading people quickly. She had read Harlan Watkins over the last half hour, and what she had read was a man who was self-contained and honest, and who had looked at her farm with the eyes of someone who actually cared about whether things held together, and who had looked at her with something that she was going to identify as simple respect and leave it at that. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow then. If the rain lets up enough to work. I'll be here by 8, he said. He finished his coffee and stood and collected his hat from the hook. At the door he paused with his hand on the latch and turned back. "Mrs. Conley," he said. "Yes. That was impressive work this morning. The wheel, I mean. The way you solved the housing track problem using the pine tar wrap before setting the new board, that's a professional solution." Henrietta met his gaze. "Thomas taught me," she said, "and then I paid attention." He nodded once and went out into the rain. She stood at the window and watched him collect his horse from the trough and ride up the creek road toward Callow Creek, and she told herself that the warmth she felt in her chest was simply the pleasure of having had an interesting conversation, and the coffee, and the satisfaction of the wheel turning again. She told herself that for about 3 days before she stopped bothering. Harlan came back the next morning as promised, at 8 o'clock precisely, arriving in the faded gray light of an October morning that had finally decided to be dry, if not warm. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the grass was still heavy with the previous day's rain, silver-beaded and cold-smelling, and his breath made small clouds in the air as he dismounted at the fence. Henrietta was already outside, carrying a basket of feed to the chickens, and she raised a hand to acknowledge him without making a production of it. He appreciated this. She could tell by the way he got straight to work pulling tools from his saddlebag, assessing the barn door, going to look at the fence rails, without needing conversation first. They worked in parallel for most of the morning. She had her own list of tasks for the day, winter preparation work that couldn't be deferred. Splitting more wood for the indoor stack, patching the henhouse insulation with straw bales, inventorying the root cellar stores. They moved around the property in an orbit that occasionally brought them close enough to exchange a few words, and then took them apart again. And Henrietta found this companionable in a way she had not expected and did not quite know how to account for. Around midday, she made lunch cornbread and dried apple slices, and a thick soup of dried beans and salt pork that had been simmering since morning, and called him in from the fence line, where he was straightening rails with the methodical efficiency of a man who had straightened a great many fence rails in his life. They ate at the table again, and this time the conversation moved more easily, the way it does between people who have spent a morning working in the same space and have arrived at a certain comfort with each other. He told her about the ranches he had worked in the territory around Dodge City, about the way the cattle drives had changed in the last few years as the railheads extended, and the long drives got shorter, about a particularly memorable spring roundup, where a thunderstorm had scattered 200 head across 15 miles of broken ground, and it had taken 6 days to get them back. She told him about the farm, about the particular qualities of the soil in the eastern field that made it good for wheat but not for corn, about the trade relationship she had built with a Mennonite family 12 miles south who had a flour mill, and who would grind her wheat at a better rate than the commercial mill in Hargrove because she had, the previous spring, helped the wife of that family during a difficult childbirth when the midwife couldn't get through a flooded creek road. "You helped with the birth." He said, "I wasn't the first choice," she said. "I was the only choice." I had read a chapter on the subject in one of the medical guides Thomas kept, and I knew to keep things clean and to keep the mother calm, and beyond that I tried to stay out of the way and let nature do its work. He was watching her with that particular attention again, the quality of attention he had when he was revising his understanding of something. "How did it go?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "Healthy boy. They named him after Thomas, actually, Thomas Epp. He'll be coming up on a year old now." Something crossed Harlan's face, a kind of quiet ache that she recognized because she had worn the same expression herself for 11 months. "You must miss him," he said. "Your husband." It was a simple and direct statement, not hedged or maneuvered into a rhetorical corner, and she found she could meet it the same way. "Every day," she said, "but I find that the missing is cleaner now than it was in the beginning. Early on it was like reaching for something and finding nothing there. Now it's more like knowing what's absent and going forward anyway." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a good way to put it," he said. "Have you lost someone?" she asked. Not to pry, but because the look on his face had been unmistakable. He turned his coffee cup in his hands again. She noticed he did this when he was thinking carefully about what to say. "My wife," he said, 4 years ago. Cholera on the way west from Tennessee. We'd been married 2 years. The word settled into the room, and Henrietta let it settle, the way you let something heavy rest rather than rushing to lift it. "I'm sorry," she said, the same way he had said it to her, simply, directly, meaning it. "Her name was Alice," he said. "She was a school teacher. She wanted to see the West more than almost anything. She had a particular idea about what it would look like, all wide skies and freedom, and she wasn't wrong about that part. She just didn't make it all the way to the seeing of it. Henrietta said nothing. She understood that some grief needed to be spoken and received, not commented on. After that, he said, I just kept moving. I didn't see any particular reason to stop anywhere. And now, she asked. He looked up at her. The question hung in the warm air of the kitchen between them, containing more than either of them was ready to acknowledge out loud. I don't know, he said. Maybe I'm starting to notice reasons. She looked at him very steadily for 3 full seconds. Then she stood up and said, There's more cornbread if you want it. And he said yes, and they ate, and the particular charged moment passed into something quieter and deeper, like water finding its level. He finished the barn door and the fence rails that afternoon and went away again before dark, saying he would return in 2 days when the chimney mortar would have dried out enough from the rain. He returned in 2 days. And then he returned 2 days after that, because there were more things to do, a section of the root cellar ceiling that needed shoring up against the frost heave, and a problem with one of the plow horse's hooves that wanted attention, and a dozen smaller repairs that accumulated the way small repairs do on a working farm when one person has been managing them all alone. Henrietta was not unaware of what was happening. She was a practical woman with a clear head and 31 years of experience reading situations, and she could see perfectly well that the professional excuse for his visits was becoming thinner by degrees, while the actual reason for them was becoming thicker. She could see it in the way he lingered over coffee at the end of the day. She could see it in the way he had begun bringing small things when he came. A bundle of good rope he'd seen at the hardware in Callow Creek, a jar of the pine tar compound that she had used on the wheel, once a small paper packet of the good coffee that he had noticed she used sparingly because it was expensive. She could see it in herself, too. In the way she found herself finishing her outdoor work earlier on the days he was expected, so that she could be inside making something decent for lunch rather than still mudded from the garden. In the way she had, without quite deciding to, moved Thomas's coat from the hook by the door to a hook at the back of the bedroom, so that there was a free hook for a visitor's hat. In the way she listened for the sound of hoofbeats on the creek road with a kind of alertness that had nothing to do with caution. They were careful with each other. They were careful in the particular way of two people who have both been through the country of loss and know its terrain well enough to understand that what they're approaching now is fragile and worth handling with some respect. On the 4th visit, about 2 weeks after the day of the rain and the wheel, he brought a small, carefully folded piece of paper and set it on the table beside his hat when he came in. "What's that?" she asked. "A letter of recommendation," he said. "From Seth Albright, who owns the mill at Hargrove, in case you want to verify that I'm who I say I am and that my work is good." Henrietta looked at the paper and then at him. "Did I ask for a recommendation?" he said. "I just thought you should have one." She unfolded the paper and read it. Seth Albright wrote in the blunt, practical prose of a man who had very little patience for formality. "Harlan Watkins worked for me for 6 weeks in the summer of '82, and he is the best craftsman I've encountered in 15 years of mill operation. He does what he says and says what he means, and his work holds." She refolded it and set it on the table. "Your work does hold," she said. "I've been watching." "I know," he said, "but I wanted you to have evidence from someone other than me." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, a cold wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, and the water wheel turned in its steady rhythm, and the October afternoon was pressing toward evening with its particular quality of prairie gold and cold shadow. "Harlan," she said. "Yes." "Are you going to stay in Callow Creek?" The question cost her something to ask. She could feel the weight of it going out across the table between them. He was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his hands and then back up at her, and his face had the quality of someone who has made a decision and is in the process of saying it out loud for the first time. "I'd like to," he said. "There's a piece of land east of town that Abe Tilden told me is being offered for sale. 40 acres with a small house and a broken-down barn. I have enough to buy it if I'm careful. I could build the barn back up, run a small operation, do repair work on the side for neighbors." He paused. "I haven't put in an offer yet." "Why not?" she asked, though she thought she knew. "Because I wanted to understand something first," he said, "whether it would be worth staying." She held his gaze. The fire in the stove clicked and settled. "And have you understood it?" she asked. "I'm getting there," he said quietly. There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that fills itself with understanding. "The letter was a considerate thing to do," she said finally. "It was the kind of thing a person does when they want to show that they can be trusted." "Yes," he said simply. "I don't need it," she said. "I've been watching you work for 2 weeks, and a person's work tells you more than their letters do." Something in him shifted, she could see it, a loosening of a kind of held breath. "Good," he said. "That's good to hear." She stood up and went to the window. The evening light was coming in low and gold across the creek, painting the turning wheel in amber and bronze. She watched it for a moment. "Buy the land, Harlan," she said. "Callow Creek is a reasonable place to stop." He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, I think it is." He left that evening as the last light was leaving the sky, and she stood on the porch and watched him ride up the creek road toward town, and the loneliness she felt when he disappeared around the Cottonwood Bend was a different quality of loneliness than the one she had been living with for 11 months. It was the kind that means something, the kind that points towards something, rather than simply marking an absence. She went inside and sat by the fire and thought about Thomas. She talked to him in her mind the way she sometimes did, in the intimate shorthand of people who have known each other long enough to not need full sentences. She told him what she was feeling and she felt, in the way that you feel things when you carry someone you loved inside you, that he would have understood. That he would have said what he often said, in that quiet, measured voice of his, when she came to a decision she'd been avoiding. Just go on then. She had been going on for 11 months. She thought she could keep going. In the weeks that followed, Harlan put in his offer on the East 40 and it was accepted. He moved into the small house there, which was rough and in need of attention, and spent the rest of October and the beginning of November making it livable. He still came to Henrietta's farm twice a week on the pretense of various repair projects, and she let this continue because the pretense was thin enough that neither of them needed to pretend to believe it while still being polite enough not to call it out directly. The town of Callow Creek, being the kind of small, close-knit community where everyone's business was generally understood to belong partly to everyone else as well, had noticed the pattern of his visits before the end of the first week. Abe Tilden had made a knowing remark about it when she came in to buy sugar and coffee, which she had answered with a look of such complete serenity that he had left it alone. The women of the Methodist congregation. She was not a regular attendee, but she was not hostile to the church either, going on the 3 or 4 occasions a year when she felt the need for communal company, had sent their awareness of the situation through their usual channels of meaningful glances and pointed silences and half-started sentences, all of which she had navigated without providing any material to work with. She did not discuss her private feelings with the community, because they were private and also because she had not fully sorted them herself, and it seemed premature to have other people forming opinions about an internal process she was still in the middle of. She was in the middle of it when the first snow came, early November, a light skiff that sat on the ground for 2 days and then melted off, leaving the world gray and cold and smelling of turned earth. Harlan came that day with a load of firewood. He had cut from his own timber stand more wood than she needed immediately, but less than she would use over the winter, cut to the right length for her firebox, which meant he had measured her firebox at some point. And this small, quiet fact of his attention moved through her the way certain kinds of music do, unexpectedly and all at once. She did not say anything about the wood except thank you. But when she brought the coffee out to where he was stacking it beside the house, she sat on the porch step and he sat beside her, closer than they had sat before, and the conversation that afternoon went to different places than it usually went. He told her about Tennessee, the farm his father had kept, the mountains that were so different from the prairie that he sometimes still felt the absence of them as a kind of phantom landscape, visible when he wasn't looking directly for it. He told her about the years after Alice died, the aimlessness that had felt at the time like freedom and had eventually revealed itself as something else. Not grief exactly, because grief was a specific and purposeful pain, but more like the state of not being oriented, of moving without a direction to move toward. She told him about the year she and Thomas had nearly lost the farm to a bad harvest, compounded by a broken axle on the wagon that had meant they couldn't get to market in time to sell what they had grown, and how they had pulled through on the charity of the Mennonite community, and a loan from Abe Tilden that Thomas had paid back to the penny over the following 2 years, and how that experience had made her understand that independence and community were not opposites, that the kind of self-sufficiency she valued was only possible because it existed within a web of mutual reliance. "That's the thing about this country," Harlan said. "It sells itself as a place where you can be entirely your own, no need for anyone else. But that's not true. Nobody makes it alone." "No," she said, "nobody does." They were sitting very close together on the porch step. The cold air pressed in around them, and the warmth of proximity was a specific and pointed thing. "Henrietta," he said. "Yes," she said, not asking what because she knew what. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you're willing to be courted. I don't want to presume, and I understand if it's too soon, and I understand if—" "Harlan," she said. "Yes. You have been courting me for 3 weeks. You have been doing it with firewood and pine tar and fence rails and a letter of recommendation." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I wasn't sure if it was obvious." "To whom?" she asked. A pause. "Abe Tilden noticed on day 4, he admitted. She laughed. It came out of her the way laughter does sometimes when you haven't done it in a while, a little rough at the start, and then full and genuine and warmer than the cold air deserved. She heard herself laughing and felt the strange, bright shock of it, the way it lit something up in her chest that had been banked and low for a very long time. He was smiling at her with a helpless kind of delight, the smile of a man who has been given something he didn't dare ask for directly. "I would like to be courted," she said when the laughter subsided, "properly and openly and without either of us pretending the other fence rails are the main point." "Yes," he said, "that would suit me considerably better." He did not kiss her that day. He reached out and took her hand, where it rested on her knee, and held it in both of his. And they sat like that on the porch step in the November cold, watching the creek and the wheel and the bare cottonwoods while the light faded. And it was the most intimate thing that had happened to her in a very long time, and she felt it in every part of her. When he left, he held her hand until the last possible moment and then let it go. And she stood on the porch and watched him go with an expression she made no effort to arrange into anything neutral. Winter came down on the Kansas prairie in earnest in December of 1882, the way it does in that country, not gradually but suddenly, with a ground blizzard that arrived on a Monday morning and didn't stop until Wednesday afternoon, leaving drifts against the fence lines and the barn wall and the north side of the house that were chest-high and hard as packed salt. The temperature dropped to the kind of cold that made metal burn and breath crystallize before it cleared your lips, and Henrietta spent 3 days barely leaving the house, except to get to the barn twice daily for the animals. Harlan came through on Thursday, after the blizzard passed, riding through the drifts that the wind had scoured down to passable depth along the creek road. He came to check on her, he said simply, and she took this without protest because she was genuinely glad to see him, and because the 3 days of solitary blizzard had compressed something in her that needed release. He stayed the afternoon, helping her dig out the path between the house and the barn, checking the animal's water which had frozen in its trough despite the insulation she had packed around it, assessing the snow load on the barn roof. They worked side by side in the brutal cold, their breath making twin clouds in the air, and when they came inside at midday for soup and warmth, he sat across from her at the table and looked at her with those steady, serious dark eyes and said, "I want to ask you something." She set down her spoon and waited. "I know it's early," he said. "I know there are people who would say it's too soon after Thomas, and I know there are things between us we haven't finished learning yet, and I'm not asking for an answer today, or next week, or next month even. But I want to ask so that you know where I stand and so that it's out there between us and we don't have to navigate around it." He stopped. He looked at his hands and then at her. "I love you," he said. "I know that's plain and direct and maybe not how a man is supposed to say it, but I'm not good at dressing things up in fancy words when the plain ones will serve. I love you, and I want to build a life with you if you'll have me, and I'm asking you not today but when you're ready to consider marrying me." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the drifts with a low, steady sound. The stove ticked. Henrietta looked at him across the table. She looked at the face of this man who had arrived too late to help her fix a water wheel in the rain and had been too stunned to speak, and who had come back twice and then again, and had been steady and honest and attentive in every way a person could be, who had built fences and split wood, and held her hand in the cold, and told her about Alice with the openness of someone who trusted her enough not to hide what had been broken in him. And she felt, with complete and total clarity, the answer to his question. "I love you too," she said. "That also seems plain and direct and exactly right." Something happened to his face. It moved through several things very quickly: relief, joy, something that was very close to tears, though he held them back with the particular stoicism of a man who had learned to hold things back, and then settled into a kind of radiant certainty that she thought was the most beautiful expression she had seen on another human face since Thomas smiled at her on their wedding day. "I won't rush you," he said. "I know," she said, "but I'm not as fragile as the timeline suggests. Thomas would have wanted me to be happy. He told me so, actually, not in so many words, but in the way he had of making sure I knew that his love for me was not a cage." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I'll come back in the spring," he said. "Once we've come through winter together, if you still feel as you do now, we'll talk about when and how." "I'll still feel as I do now," she said with quiet certainty. "But come back in the spring anyway." He kissed her then, for the first time leaning across the small table to reach her, a gentle and serious kiss that tasted of wood smoke and cold air and coffee, and that lasted just long enough to be definite. When it ended, she kept her eyes closed for a moment, and she heard him make a very soft sound that was not quite a word, just a sound of something that had been held for a long time and was finally allowed to land. December passed. January came with even harder cold, and February was the worst of it: 2 more blizzards, temperatures that went below zero and stayed there, the particular prairie winter that tested what people and buildings and animals were made of. Harlan came when the roads allowed, and she came into Callow Creek on the same condition, and the community watched with the interested but mostly benevolent eye of a small town that has decided it approves of something. Not everyone approved. There were a few misses. Hadley at the millinery and old Bertram case, who had been after the Conley land since before Thomas died, who made noises about propriety and haste, and the unseemly business of a widow carrying on not a full year after her husband's passing. Henrietta had heard these remarks through the community's efficient informal communication system, and had chosen to address them in the most effective way available, which was to ignore them entirely while continuing to conduct herself with absolute dignity, and to let the nature of what she and Harlan actually were to each other speak for itself. What they were was people who loved each other, and were taking their time and being honest about it. There was nothing to reproach in that, and eventually even Mrs. Hadley came around, partly because Harlan had repaired the millinery's back wall at no charge when a February wind tore the planking loose, and this kind of practical charity had a clarifying effect on people's moral arithmetic. In March, When the first green showed in the grass along the creek and the water in the wheel housing ran clear and cold, and the cottonwoods put out their first pale buds, Harlan came to Henrietta's farm on a Sunday afternoon with his hat in his hands and a small box he had ordered from a jeweler in Hargrove. Inside the box was a ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, dark red as a ripe rose hip, and when he opened the box and showed it to her, she looked at it for a long time and felt the full weight of what was being offered and what she was about to receive. "The garnet was Alice's," he said. "She wore it as a pendant. The jeweler in Hargrove reset it for me. I hope that's all right. I wanted something of her to come with me into the next part of my life." Henrietta looked up at him, and she felt the tightness in her throat that meant she was going to be moved whether she wanted to be or not. "That is not just all right," she said. "That is exactly right." He put the ring on her finger, and then he held her face in both his rough, careful hands and kissed her forehead, and she leaned into him and felt the warmth of him and the solidness of him, and the specific and unrepeatable feeling of being held by someone who knows what loss is and chooses to show up anyway. "Yes," she said, though technically he had not yet asked the question this second time, and he laughed quietly against her hair. "Yes," he agreed. They were married in April of 1883 in the small Methodist church in Callow Creek on a Saturday morning when the prairie was all green and gold, and the sky was the particular deep blue of the Kansas spring that seemed to go up forever. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Aldous Marsh, who was a practical and warm-hearted man with a tendency to make his sermons longer than necessary, but his wedding ceremonies exactly the right length. Abe Tilden was there, beaming with the satisfaction of a man who felt personally responsible for the outcome. The Mennonite family, the Epps, came with young Thomas Epp, nearly 1 year old and serious-faced, who regarded the proceedings with the grave interest of a person encountering a new and important piece of information. Henrietta wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself over the winter months, and her dark hair was pinned up with a small spray of the first wildflowers. The season had produced blue-eyed grass and pale prairie phlox, and she looked, said old Abe Tilden to anyone who would listen, like the best thing that had happened to this particular square mile of Kansas. Harlan Watkins, in his good shirt and his hair combed with more care than usual, stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle on her own because there was no father or brother available to walk her, and she had told Harlan that she wanted to come to him under her own power, and he watched her come, and his face did the thing it did when she caught him off guard. It went completely, helplessly open. All the composed steadiness that was his usual expression simply dissolved in the face of her, and she saw it and loved him for it all over again. After the ceremony there was a reception in the town hall, food contributed by half the families in the county it seemed, music provided by a fiddler named Cal Dempsey, who could make a waltz sound like the most serious and important thing happening in the world. Harlan danced with Henrietta with the careful concentration of a man who had not danced in quite some time but was deeply committed to not stepping on her feet, and she found this so endearing that she pressed her face briefly into the wool of his shoulder to hide her expression. "Am I doing all right?" he murmured. "You're doing fine," she said into the wool. "Better than you think." That night they rode back to the Conley farm together. It was still the Conley farm by name, though they would change that eventually, in the April dark, with the stars coming out one by one above the prairie and the creek road silvery in the moonlight, and the water wheel turning in its patient, ancient rhythm as they rode past it toward the house. Henrietta sat beside him on the wagon seat, his arm around her shoulders, and she looked at the wheel as they passed it and thought about the morning in October when she had stood in the cold rain and worked until her hands went numb to make it turn again. And she thought about the man who had arrived too late to help and stood by his horse with his mouth open and his eyes full of astonishment. And she thought about everything that had followed from that moment, the coffee, the conversations, the firewood. The hand held on the porch step, the ring with the garnet, the blue dress, the waltz. And she thought that Thomas, wherever he was, would have looked at all of this and nodded once with that quiet, satisfied look he had given the wheel when it first turned. They went inside. They closed the door on the April night. Life settled into a new shape in the months that followed, the shape of two people building something together with full awareness of what they were doing and why. Harlan moved entirely to the Conley farm and leased his East 40 acres to a young family newly arrived from Missouri who needed land and were glad of it. His skills as a carpenter and repairman became an important part of their livelihood. He built a reputation in Callow Creek and the surrounding townships as someone who could fix anything, who would say honestly what something would cost and then do it for that price, and who could look at a broken mechanism and understand it the way Thomas had understood the water wheel, with a combination of learned knowledge and practical intuition. Henrietta ran the farm. She was still the force of it, still the person who made the decisions about what to plant and when and at what price to sell, still the woman who handled the business of the household with a precision that Harlan admired openly and genuinely. He had not married her expecting to take over. He had married her knowing what she was, and he moved into the structure of her world with the same care he brought to everything, adding to it rather than reshaping it. They had arguments. Real ones, occasionally, because they were both people with strong views and the confidence to express them, and because the business of building a life together involves 1,000 small negotiations, many of them not small at all. They argued about money once, significantly about whether to expand the wheat planting into the eastern field or hold it as pasture, and the argument went a full day, and part of an evening before they reached a resolution that was genuinely a compromise and not a surrender by either party. They argued about a boundary dispute with Bertram Case, who continued to be difficult about the fence line between their properties, and Henrietta won that argument both with Harlan and eventually with Case himself, by producing the original land survey document with a calmness that made Harlan love her more than he had that morning, which was already a great deal. They were happy. Not in the simple, unblemished way that people who have not lived through loss can be happy, but in the richer, more deliberate way of people who know what the alternative is and choose this instead, every day. In the winter of 1883, Henrietta discovered she was pregnant. She told Harlan on a December evening when they were sitting by the fire after supper, in the particular warm quiet of a winter night when the wind was outside and the fire was in, and there was nowhere either of them needed to be. She told him simply, without ceremony, the way she told him most important things. He looked at her. He set down his coffee cup. He crossed the room, not quickly but with absolute intention, and knelt beside her chair and took both her hands in his and pressed them to his mouth and held them there for a long moment, his eyes closed, his breathing unsteady in a way she had never heard before. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. He looked up at her. His eyes were wet. He didn't try to hide it. "I'm better than all right," he said, his voice rough with it. Alice and I tried. It didn't happen for us before she got sick. I thought I wasn't sure if I would ever. I know," she said softly. He pressed his forehead to their joined hands and stayed there for a moment. She stroked his hair with her free hand, the dark hair that was just beginning to show gray at the temples, and she felt the trembling in him that was not grief but its opposite, joy, arriving with the specific intensity that it has when it comes after long absence. "A baby," he said, like a man saying the word for the first time. "A baby," she confirmed. He stayed kneeling beside her chair for a long time after that, and she let him, because some things need to be sat with. The pregnancy went well. She was healthy and strong, and the child, clearly taking after both parents in terms of sheer determination, gave no particular trouble throughout the long winter and into the spring. Henrietta kept working through most of it, at a somewhat adjusted pace that she negotiated with herself honestly, and without either recklessness or unnecessary caution. She knew her own body and she listened to it, and she accepted Harlan's help without resentment when she needed it, which was more often than she would have accepted it a year earlier, and which felt now simply natural. The baby was born in August of 1884, on a hot prairie night when the air smelled of dry grass and distant rain, delivered by Mrs. Renfrew, the midwife who operated out of Callow Creek, and who was, by common agreement, the most capable person in 3 counties at the job she did. Harlan sat in the kitchen through the long hours of labor, getting up every 10 minutes to stand at the bedroom door and be waved back by Mrs. Renfrew with the practiced authority of a woman who had handled anxious fathers for 30 years. When the baby finally arrived, just past midnight, and Mrs. Renfrew opened the bedroom door and said, "Mr. Watkins, you have a son," Harlan sat very still for a moment, and then he stood up and went in, and Henrietta saw his face in the lamplight and thought that she would carry that expression with her for the rest of her life. The face of a man who has arrived at something he was afraid might not exist and found it real. She was holding the baby, who was red-faced and outraged and had Harlan's dark eyes, and Henrietta was fairly certain already, her own stubborn jaw. "Come here," she said. He came. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with the same expression he had turned on the water wheel that first day, complete, undisguised astonishment, mixed now with a reverence that the water wheel had not entirely warranted, but that the small person in his wife's arms absolutely did. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly, as though volume might break something. The baby opened his eyes and looked up at his father with the unfocused, ancient solemnity of the newborn, and Harlan made a sound very low in his chest that Henrietta recognized, because she felt it too, as the sound of something that had been searching for its home finding it at last. They named him James Thomas Watkins, James for Harlan's father, Thomas for the man who had loved Henrietta and built a water wheel and left her a farm and the strength to keep going. Mrs. Renfrew said it was a good, strong name. Abe Tilden, when told, declared that it was the finest thing to happen in Callow Creek all year, which, given that it was only August, was somewhat qualified praise, but he meant it well. James was a serious, observant baby who became a serious, observant child, with a talent for fixing things that showed itself as soon as he was old enough to pick them up and take them apart, and which made both his parents quietly certain he was connected to something they didn't fully understand. He spent hours at the creek bank watching the water wheel turn, and he asked Harlan questions about how it worked with the focused intensity of a person who requires a satisfying answer and will not be put off with approximations. Harlan answered every question fully. Life on the farm grew and changed with the years. The farm grew. They bought an additional 20 acres in 1886 when the Whitmore family moved on, and Harlan's carpentry business expanded as Callow Creek itself expanded, bringing new families and new buildings and new needs for the kind of skilled, reliable work that built a reputation that reached beyond the immediate community. And Henrietta continued to be who she was. She continued to manage the business side of the farm with the same precision and directness that had characterized her widowhood, now operating from a position of somewhat less solitude and considerably more happiness, but with no diminution of the qualities that had gotten her through those 11 months of managing everything alone. She became, over the years, something of a known quantity in the broader community. The woman people came to when they needed practical advice on farming matters, on dealing with difficult merchants, on the 1,000 small crises that a frontier community generated at regular intervals. In 1887, Bertram Case finally gave up trying to dispute the fence line and sold his property, which went to a young German immigrant family named Schraber, who turned out to be excellent neighbors and very good bakers, which improved the quality of Sunday afternoons in the Watkins household considerably. In 1888, their daughter Clara was born, a small, fierce person with Henrietta's dark hair and Harlan's quiet steadiness, and who could walk at 9 months and was asking questions in complete sentences before she was 2, and who attached herself to her brother James with a devoted ferocity that he, at 4 years old, received with the patient bewilderment of a boy being claimed by a force of nature. In the evenings, when the work was done and the children were in bed, and the last of the summer light was leaving the prairie sky, Henrietta and Harlan would sometimes sit on the porch, step the same porch step where he had held her hand for the first time in the November cold of 1882, and listen to the creek and the cottonwoods and the particular silence of the prairie at dusk, which was not really silence at all but the enormous aggregate sound of a living world. Sometimes she thought about the morning in the rain, the way she had waded into the cold creek and worked until her hands went numb, alone, in the driving October rain of the Kansas autumn, feeling the full weight of everything that had been broken and everything that needed to be made right. The way the wheel had finally turned under her hands, one full revolution, and then another. The way she had turned around and found a man on a bay horse, looking at her with an expression that encompassed everything she had not yet known was about to happen to her. One autumn evening in 1889, sitting on the porch step while the creek ran past in the gathering dark, Harlan said, "Do you ever think about that first day?" "All the time," she said. "I think about it every time I look at the wheel," he said. "I think about how I was riding up ready to be useful and I came around the bend and there you were, coming out of the water, soaked completely through, and the wheel was already turning behind you." She smiled. "You couldn't speak," she said. "I could not speak," he agreed. "I had nothing. I had arrived completely unprepared for what you were." "What was I?" she asked, leaning slightly into his shoulder. He thought about this in the particular, careful way he had with questions that deserved real answers. "You were someone who had already taken care of the thing that needed taking care of," he said. "And you were going to take care of the next thing too, and the thing after that, without waiting for someone to come along and do it for you. And I stood there on my horse thinking, what is a man supposed to do with that?" "And what did you decide?" she asked. "I decided to ask about your axe handle," he said. She laughed, that full, warm laugh that still surprised her sometimes with its own fullness. She felt him laughing too, the quiet shake of it in his chest where her head was resting. The creek ran past them in the dark. The water wheel turned. "I'm glad you came anyway," she said, "late and speechless as you were. I'm glad you let me stay," he said. "Knowing I'd missed the actual work. You made up for it," she said. He put his arm around her, and she settled into the familiar warm weight of him. And they sat in the October evening, and listened to the wheel and the creek and the cottonwoods, and the sounds of their children inside the house. James's voice asking something and Clara's voice answering with the authority of a younger sibling, who has never accepted the premise that 4 years of additional experience confers any particular wisdom, and Henrietta felt, with the clear and quiet certainty of a woman who has done the arithmetic on her own life and found it favorable, that this was what it was supposed to be. Not perfect. Not without grief or work, or the occasional argument about the eastern field, or the continuing problem of the north chimney that needed repointing every few years no matter how carefully it was done, or the unpredictability of wheat prices, or the hard winters that came on without warning and the dry summers that could turn a good crop to dust in 3 weeks. Not free of memory, either. Thomas was in this house still, in the books on the shelf, in the quality of the soil in the eastern field that he had spent 3 years amending and improving, in the name of the boy who was his age now in some interior way that couldn't quite be articulated. He was in the wheel, most of all the wheel he had built with timber from Hargrove and read about in books until the covers came off, and that Henrietta had fixed in the rain with a pine tar wrap and a pry bar, and the particular quality of attention she had learned in part from loving him. She had fixed it alone. She had always known she could. But the wheel turned better, she thought, for having someone to come home to at the end of a day of turning it. She looked up at Harlan's face in the evening light. He was looking at the wheel with the expression she thought of as his thinking face, quiet and attentive, taking in whatever the world was offering. "I love you," she said. He looked down at her. He smiled, that smile that had come so slowly at the beginning, measured and careful, and that now came as easily as breathing. "I love you," he said, simple, plain, the only words that fully served. The wheel turned. The stars came out above the prairie, one by one, as they always had over this particular stretch of Kansas ground, as they would continue to do long after both of them were gone and some other family was living in this house, and walking along this creek, and wondering about the people whose names were carved into the old cottonwood by the bank. T.C. 1876 and H.C., and below that in different handwriting, H.W. 1883, and below that still, in the careful block letters of a child learning to carve, J.T.W. and C.W., because James had insisted that Clara get her initials there too, even though she had been too small to hold the knife herself. The record of a family. The record of a life built from grief and work and the stubborn insistence on going forward. Henrietta did not carve her own initials again. She felt they were already there, in everything, in the field, in the repaired chimney, in the wheel that turned all night in the cold water of the creek, patient and faithful and steady as everything she had ever loved. The night deepened. The children's voices inside the house quieted as they went asleep. The creek ran on. And Henrietta Conley, who had become Henrietta Watkins, who had been a widow and before that a wife, and before that a woman who had known exactly what she was capable of and had never once talked herself out of it, sat on the porch step in the October dark with her husband's arm around her and her children asleep in the house behind her and the wheel turning in the creek before her, and she let herself be, entirely and without reservation, happy. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the way that only things earned by loss and labor and the willingness to begin again can be, everything. In the spring of 1891, James turned 6 years old, and Henrietta gave him one of Thomas's books on mechanics, the one about millwork and water systems, the one whose cover had come off from being read too many times. She had repaired the cover herself, with a piece of good leather and small, neat stitches. James sat at the kitchen table with the book open before him, turning pages with the careful reverence of a child who understands that he is handling something that mattered to someone. And Henrietta stood in the doorway and watched him and felt Thomas in the room as clearly as she had ever felt anything. Harlan came in from outside, stamping mud off his boots, and looked at his son with the book and then at Henrietta's face in the doorway, and he did not ask what she was feeling because he already knew. He crossed the room and stood beside her and put his hand against the small of her back, and they watched their son read their history together. "Do you think he'll build things?" Harlan asked quietly. "I think he'll build everything," Henrietta said. Clara appeared at the top of the loft stairs, 2 years old and incapable of tolerating the idea that something interesting was happening without her in it, and made her way down the stairs with the focused determination of a small person who has decided that caution is for other people, and went directly to the table and climbed onto the bench beside her brother and put her finger on a drawing in the book and said with complete authority, "Wheel." James looked at her. "That's a gear," he said patiently. "Wheel," Clara said again, with the confidence of someone who has decided they are right and additional information is not required. Harlan laughed. Henrietta laughed. James looked between them both with the expression of a person surrounded by unreasonable behavior, which only made them laugh more. The sound of it filled the house, rolled out the open door, mixed with the sound of the April wind and the creek and the wheel turning, always turning, in the cold, clear water below the cottonwoods. And the wheel turned on.